So just a little bit about me. My name is Anna, and I am a graphic designer and a maker. So I frequently use the laser machines, often at MADE, the makerspace downtown. And I use it for my own personal projects, and I like to use it for prototyping packaging for some of my design clients. So we're going to talk about what lasers can do and how to make your own project. So I'm going to share my screen with you. Oh, I can't. Mary, can you enable my screen sharing, please?
Is it working now?
There it goes. Yes. Oh, Zoom is. Not letting me share. Oh, there it goes. All right. So we're going to talk about CNC lasers, which are for cutting and engraving. Let's see if I can hear this. All right. So first, we're going to talk about what CNC lasers are, how to design for CNC lasers. We'll talk about the fabrication, how to do operations, and different advanced methods. So a CNC laser, normally you don't see the word CNC, but it is a computer numerically controlled laser. So that means the computer is actually driving the laser. They're kind of the brains of the operation. And a laser is a cutting machine. And it can do a lot more than cut, which we will talk about, but know that the computer is where it gets like all of the wealth out of it. So how does a laser work? So this picture shows a beam, and a lot of lasers look different, but in general, they'll all have a type of beam with this type of laser head below. And there's different parts that build this up. This beam is to hold the head of the laser that has a lens, the laser beam itself, and there's a spot at the bottom for it to focus. And the way this works is that on this beam, it is set so it can only move east and west. Well, we'll talk about the details of that in a minute. So there's a tube that has the CO2. There's different mirrors. So you can see that the beam of light kind of reflects against these mirrors, and it goes down into where the lens is, and it shoots down onto the material. So this is your substrate or the material. And what it is laying on the bed, which is the bed of the laser. So there's the Y arm and X arm. So you are actually able to change the depth of your machine depending on what type of material you're using. And this will help for certain projects. So it's a computer, the CNC is computer numerically controlled. So what that means is it's also using something called a G code. A G code is a bunch of different numbers that make up where the computer should go. So this is kind of the code. There's a bunch of, it'll either start with the letter G or letter M and have different numerical numbers afterwards that can have X and Y coordinates. And that tells the laser exactly where it should go. So as we use the lasers, we're usually just designing with images and pictures. If you really wanted, you can actually set this up in code, but you typically don't because there's just so much code to write for this, but it all is all numerically valued. So the advantages of a laser is that it has very high accuracy and detail. So this picture is of different layers of wood, and you can kind of see how thin you can get and how much detail you get. There's a very low kerf, which means you can get those fine details, and we'll talk more about like what that kerf means. There's so many different materials you can use, which is why it's so everyone loves using the lasers. There's so much to do with it. And it can be very complex. So you don't just have to do a flat project. You can do something that's a lot more 3D and something that builds on each other. And it's very fast. You can do a design and end your project in a couple hours. So a typical workflow is, it's really smart to have your design first. That's before you do your project. So you first need your idea. What are you gonna make? And something we will work on making later is an ornament, or try and like talk about different ways to just put some projects together. So something small and something that you can make in even under 10 minutes. Then it's good to select your materials. And there's a whole bunch of different options out there. You could even use something you have at home if you want to just personalize something that you have. And we'll get those ideas when we look at the different examples. Then there's different operation modes. Then you will, there's also, what I didn't add was which program you're actually going to design it in. Then you're going to export your image or your files. And then there's going to be the fabrication process. So it's the post-processing of your project, and then the machine's going to do its work, and it's going to cut and engrave. So we're going to talk about how to set up designs for the laser. And what materials you'll need. So there's wood and plywood, and you can see from this image, half of it is cut out and half is engraved. So this kind of like darker sand is been cut out, and on the left side, it's like completely cut out versus it being just engraved on the right. So the difference between wood and plywood is the plywood, if you engrave it, it leaves like this tiger stripe because the material itself isn't as strong. There's a lot more, there's a lot less like detail in it. It's a lot more porous where it can expand. So when you try and engrave it, you're going to see that detail of the material because it's just not as well made. Where these examples of wood here, like something like cherry or walnut, it's going to be very rich, and the material itself might be a little bit more expensive, but the quality in the end is going to be a lot better. So if you're using wood, these are some examples of projects you can make. It's very common to see different types of wood wall art. A lot of people call them mandalas. And they're multi-layered, they can be very beautiful, lots of layers of wood. And it's very easy to design because you can just kind of set one actual layer and multiply it and change the size. And you get a beautiful mandala after different colors of paint and different layers of printing. Boxes are very common. They're very easy to make, and we'll talk a little bit about the joinery options, but they're super simple. It's one layer and you can engrave it, you can etch on it, and it can make a beautiful product very simple. And keychains like magnets, all these kind of like coasters, little things like that. It's very easy to get some wood and engrave your logo, your company, or just a cute like wedding gift. It's very common and very easy to do. Plastics are another big one. This is different from 3D printing because here we're mostly using acrylic. And acrylic is really nice because it comes in a variety of colors. And it can be really, not necessarily cheap, but it can be really good for like parties. You'll see it a lot on cake toppers, which is what that blue image looks like. It could be good for names. You can see it in little cupcakes, and it can be really thin. You can get it to be really thick, where it's good for more jewelry and more like wearables. And the really thin stuff you would more use for like the pastries. And then you can do like the 3D sculpture. So you'll see a lot of trophies, or those are boxes on the edge that showcase like a lot more of a very well-made product, but it's all by using the laser machine. And what's really interesting is the star trophy. the writing on there in white, that's also been engraved. So when you engrave on clear acrylic, it turns white. So that's something that is just good to know, but it's very cool to see. And it makes this trophy look very rich and sharp. Metal is another big one. Depending on what kind of metal you're using, the laser machine is perfect. There are other machines you can use like the water jet, which is a lot more heavy duty for something bigger and stronger. But if you're just making jewelry, metal is very easy to use. Engraved aluminum is really common. So you can put your own computer in the laser machine and engrave your own design on that, which a lot of people like to do. It's very fun if you can commit to a design on your computer. Even wall art. So there's different thicknesses of the metal you can get. So something lighter would be fun for the wall. Leather is really cool to engrave. Now, as you can see, like leather has a variety of colors. Like there is black leather, there's some gold leather, but when you engrave it, it's going to stay the darker leather color, which you can tell if you usually see like underneath if you're getting raw leather, like a sleeve or a sheet of it, that's the new color you're going to see. So these are common items that you'll see on Etsy. You'll see a lot of passports and journals. You can get belts and collars and like bracelets and things made out of that with a cool engraved design. And what's fun about leather is that it definitely looks very sharp and it looks really cool. But when you cut it, it does have a strong scent to it. So you do have to be careful that you don't inhale a lot of those fumes when you cut leather, but it's a very cool thing to play with. And in addition to leather, you can do many different types of fabric. And I think fabric is really fun. It's something that you'll see a lot of designers do, and you'll see it in just everyday clothing as well, that there's a lot of like cutout material. You'll see it in a lot of dresses, and some can be totally cut out and some can be that engraved look like the fleece. So it's very easy to just kind of engrave your pattern on different types of fabric. The denim turns very cool. It's got that washed look to it with a different design, but you can do so many different options and really play with like maybe engraving something on your jean pockets, or a jean jacket like on the collar only, something very specific that's either just for you or it can be specific for a brand of your company or your business. Paper is really fun. You can get very fine detail. So that's that low kerf we were talking about, where it can be really thin and small. And so these show a little bit difference of options of paper. And because it's also, the laser machine can cut, you can also have it fold. Like it can't fold for you, but you can have it almost like cut the paper where it's just slightly cutting it, where it's enough that it'll actually fold. So if you ever wanted to do like an origami project that seems really complicated, if you set it out flat with a bunch of fold lines and have the machine cut it for you, then you can fold it together yourself very easily. So paper has a lot of flexibility. You can also engrave on paper. So it actually cuts off the top layer of the material and it shows what's underneath. And it kind of depends on the paper you use and what it's dyed with, but it can create some pretty cool designs. Glass is another big one that you'll see, and it's also a very good one for gifts. So a lot of them you'll see for glasses, and you can customize that. You can cut and engrave on mirrors, and 3D sculptures is another big one. So glasses, very flexible and easy to use. And you can also use food. Any type of food item you put in there, bread, these cookies, chocolate, it'll engrave your design on there, which is super cool. It's not necessarily edible afterwards. Some people might eat it, but it's more of just fun to play with and see what happens. But it definitely makes food more interesting when it has your designs on it, especially the cookies. So we're going to talk about operation modes and how to actually set up a project. So when you're working with a laser, there's two different types of images you can use. You can use a vector graphic or a raster or bitmap graphic. So a vector graphic is something that can be as large as you want and it will never lose the quality. And that's a very good thing to have. A raster or bitmap graphic is something that is a specific size, and if you need it to be bigger, it might not necessarily look good, which is why the E is a little bit rough around the edges. Because if you're using a found image, or maybe you're working on something and it's just too small that you want to make larger, or even just the size of it in general, it might just look a little bit too pixelated or look a little fuzzy, which I'm sure you guys have seen before, either on the internet, on your phone, in books. Those fuzzy images, they're just too small to be printed. And that's why it's better to go with vector graphics. Now, it does depend on the project and depends on what type of file you are, like what you want to do, whether you want to engrave or what you want to cut. But in the end, depending on your project, vector graphics are usually the better way to go. When you're using those raster images, something to know is dots per inch, which is commonly known as DPI. You'll also see that as lines per inch, depending on the laser machine that you're working with. And what that means is a raster image is made up of dots. So if we go back, you can see that a vector graphic is outlined of points, and a raster graphic is little pixels making up that larger image. So that's what the dots per inch is. These are little dots that are making up a picture. And what you can see are the different values of dots per inch make up the quality of image. So 1000 DPI has a quality that's perfect for the image, versus 125, and you can't really tell what it is. You can tell that there's dots, and you can tell that it's trying to make a picture. But as you get finer and finer, so more dots, the better the picture quality is. So it's something to keep in mind when you want to use something like a picture for your project, is how high quality is it? And that's something you can kind of find out and play with, which we'll talk about later today too. So when you're working with vector and raster, there's the different options you can use on the machine. So for vector, you're going to cut out your project. So cutting kind of like it takes out the inner piece, or you can have an outer piece. There's raster engraving or etching, which is taking away that top material. And there's vector scoring. Vector scoring is the outline. So you're not using a raster image, but like an outline of a vector. Well, we'll talk about grade engraving. So again, just to kind of get the point across, the vector is more about following the line. It's not doing the details, where a raster image is going to go back, and the laser is going to go back and forth, and it's going to deeply take out that material. So it's very similar to like a printer at home, where the ink head goes back and forth to get your print, and you're left with black ink leaving like what you want to read. So that's similar to what the laser cutter is doing. So there's the cutting that we talked about, and this is using a vector graphic. Raster, this is using the different power, so it's taking away that top material, and this is showing an example of different power and speed and how deep it can go, which really changes the color. So you can kind of see a gradient here. And scoring is that outline. So it's like the mix. So something to know is that when you are scoring a line, it does not have a thickness to it. It's not like setting a stroke to an object. So the line is set very specific. But if you can play with the focus of a laser, you can actually pretend that it makes a thickness, which is what you see over here, where it kind of thickens the lines a little bit. But you're typically going to keep your laser in focus at all times, or you're never going to adjust it. And that's when you would change your own line thickness, and there's a way we'll show you how. And also to note that if you raster engrave the same image as the vector score, the engraving will take a lot longer than scoring, because the raster engraving is going back and forth, and the vector scoring is just doing the outlines of those squares. So you can see 1 minute and 20 seconds doesn't seem like that long, but compared to 3 seconds, that's a lot of time. So if you're doing a large project or making a lot of one little item, such as an ornament, that can change what type of like what your end result wants to be. So sometimes your time might change what style of the project you're going to do. And something that's really good is to combine all three. So this shows this design being cut out. There's little elements that are cut out. The dark tan area is more of that engraving. And this has an outline. So you can kind of see in this image, there's red lines around the black. The red lines around the black are doing that scoring. And what that scoring is doing around the black raster engraving is it's enhancing it even more. So that way it looks even sharper, and it just makes it look a lot stronger as a design itself. Grade engraving is setting up kind of like a gradient, and it's a mix. It's the raster engraving, but it's with a gradient. And it's not always done as a raster, but it can be done as a vector. My computer's buzzing out. So something that's very common is, turn that off. Oops. Sorry, my computer is buzzing. Something that's very common is to use this in a stamp. So you can see that this has 3 different passes. If you do a stamp, the more passes that you do, the deeper the engraving becomes, and that way the stamp itself becomes a perfect mix. So sometimes if you've used a stamp and you get a lot of that background, it might not have been engraved deeply enough. So it might just need another pass. And that happens with any type of homemade stamps. So now we'll talk about exporting. So when you have your raster and vector images, your raster image can only raster engrave. Your vector image, it can cut, it can score, can also raster engrave, and it can also grade engrave. And there's a bunch of different software you guys can use. There is software specifically for raster, and that's like your Microsoft Paint. GIMP is basically like a free version of Photoshop that you can use, but with a lot less complexity. And Photoshop would be like the master raster program. For vector, it's very common to use CorelDRAW. The free version of Illustrator is Inkscape that you can use at home. Again, Illustrator is more the master one. And there's 3D software like Autodesk that if you wanted to create something like a wooden box, you can set that up in a 3D software and print out the flat files of. The most common is probably to just use Inkscape that you can use at home, and you can easily bring those files into Adobe Illustrator and send them right to a printer. When you export for raster images, these are made up of those little pixels. So each pixel is like made of a black design. And there can be different styles of bitmaps. So 1 bitmap versus 2 bitmaps. You can see in this first one with the bird, it's very sharp black and white. And the panda has a lot more variations of gray, black and white. And in the middle, you can see that it says dither. There's a lot more dots in this image. So we're gonna play with that in Photoshop and see what that looks like. But depending on the image you use, these are examples that you can actually print. You might want it to be very sharp, or you might want that kind of like dot look to it. Another word is a halftone pattern. So it depends on the project you're doing, and it depends on the files that you have, but it's something kind of in the range you want to play with. And there's different image file types that you can use, but it definitely depends on the laser machine you're using. Not all machines take JPEG, not all machines might take a PDF, but these are very common raster images that you can export, and anything can be converted. Okay, for a vector export, this is an outline. You can see this is going to make a lantern, and you can set this as a DXF or XVG. So very common vector files, and it's just one design and it's all flat. When you set up a project, it is important to know exactly where on your files you want to have a fill and you want to have a stroke. So the first star is a full fill. The next one has this thicker outline, but it's very important to set that as a big shape. And then the third one has an outline as well as a stroke on the middle. So it's very important to know, like, where on your projects do you want something to be fully engraved, or do you want just an outline of something engraved? Because that might make a difference. So we'll talk about the fabrication and the production of your project. So when you are working with your projects, you need to have your files ready to go. You're going to keep your vector lines together by joining them. You can enrage, sometimes you can enrage the layers, and sometimes you might just have everything on one layer and cut as is. There's going to be different operation modes. That would be like cutting or engraving. Arrange your workspace, so make sure everything is appropriate and laid out on the material. And you're going to export and hit ready to print. It's important to just know safety measures when you're around a laser machine. Don't turn the machine on if it's not closed or prepared. You don't want that laser to fire with the lid open. Things can catch fire, but there are special fire extinguishers for machines that would be okay. And it's important to avoid looking at the laser. I always look at my project to make sure it's going okay, nothing is messing up or the material has moved, but you don't want to stare at something if it's going to be going on for an hour, or it doesn't matter. Just take a look at it, make sure it's working, and then look away. And make sure you avoid inhaling those fumes, especially if you're working with a strong scented material. So first we'll prep the material, and then we would download our files, and then you would work on using the laser itself. You're going to focus the laser, make sure it is like clear and you get those strong lines. Make sure your material and the laser are in the right spot, and then you can actually start. So we'll talk about a few advanced techniques. Something that is good to know is when you are working with wood, you can get a lot of smoky edges when you do a raster engraving. And a big technique is if you put masking tape on top of your material before you raster engrave, you won't have any of the smoke residue. Now, this is a really good technique, but it's not ideal for all projects if you have fine detail. So this letter M is really bold and heavy, and that masking tape will be very easily to peel off when you're done. But if you're working with something very intricate, like a lacy type of design, you're gonna have to peel that off in each little spot. And that might not be ideal because the laser is going to adhere that tape to the board a little bit more. It's very easy to come off, but you don't want to be peeling tape off of little spots all over. So keep in mind, depending on what you're doing, do you want to use tape or not? And if you're going to be painting it, depending if that's after, then you don't need the tape. Using something called indexing or a rotary tool is you can do things that are actually already round. So a lot of things are more of those glasses, but more of that like full 360 design. The candle holders, paper products. I cut out paper, like a lot of like those old oatmeal tins or something are made of cardboard, and you could put that on a rotary tool and cut it out. This also engraves the images on glass, and not all machines give you the rotary option, but it's an advanced technique that's very interesting to learn. So this is more about that curve cutting and how fine the machine can go. What's really cool is you can actually get a very tight design using wood, and it kind of becomes bendable. And you can make some very interesting projects with that. So you'll see a lot of boxes, you'll see a lot of lamps. You can, because it can bend, you can really change the material and what it can do. And that makes it very interesting. And if you look closely, like each one has a little different design, because depending on how tight your design is, the different types of bend you're gonna get. Another advanced technique is doing something double-sided. And something that's double-sided, which this example is not very good because this person obviously needed to mask their image or their material, but you would create a cardboard jig. It could be a wooden jig. And what that is you cut out kind of like the space that your material is going to fit into, and you can just plop them in over and over and over. So if you're doing multiples of something, this could be a really interesting way to do it. And you can also turn the same material over, so you can get, you can do both sides. And that makes the product itself like a lot better in general, like a better design, and the user is gonna appreciate it more. There's more inside of this than just one-sided, something's engraved. Another fun thing is the joinery, which we talked about, like making boxes and things. It's the way the kerf works is you get to, depending on the material, you can get some very fine details and some very thick, and use very thick material. So if you're using wood, you can set it up to cut out your different joineries in the right way. So there's a whole bunch of different options, and this is a little bit more advanced depending on like if you want to do something 3D or make something a little bit more structured. It could just be like simple slots, but there could be something like a little bit more dovetail-like. So it's very interesting to use, but it's something where you have to understand what type of material you're going to use and learn how to tolerance your laser. And here's more of that joinery options. 3D boxes, these are like this is very intense, but a little bit more detail of like how fine of joineries you can get. Another interesting thing is slicing. So you can do slicing materials where you're still cutting it out flat, but depending on how you set up your file, you can make this like very cool, intricate 3D sculpture. This is something also you can set up in that 3D file and turn it into a slicing mode, which is another advanced technique, but something very cool that you'll see a lot of. So setting up that tolerance of the laser is where you have to understand how thick your material is and how much it's going to cut. And your pieces are going to come together depending on the type of thickness that the material is. So it's kind of a trial and error, and you have to test a lot when you're cutting your machine, like cutting your material. But the kerf is depending on the material. So like if you're cutting like a 1/4 inch piece of wood, it's going to have a thicker slice down the middle than if you're cutting paper. So it's just something to play with. Another thing to do when you are at this point is to nest your files. And this is a very good technique to start with. It's a good practice if you can. It's not do or die, but when you are trying to save material, it's very important that you nest your pieces together in the right way. So if I knew like I want to make some very intricate 3D design, I want to put all my material, I want to put all my elements like on the board as much as possible. So that way you have no material waste at the end, because the material waste in the end is just losing you money. So I'm going to talk about a few things. Let's see. Actually, I'm just going to get into some design stuff really quick, and then we'll talk a little bit about the Glowforge. Okay, so I want to talk about how to set up a bitmap image, and we're also going to vectorize it. And then I'm going to show you a little bit about the Glowforge, just some images that I have. But I think this is important to see because not a lot of people know exactly how to do a bitmap image. So something that you have is everyone has a photo. And what would be cuter than to make like a cute little ornament of like, you could do a family photo or an ornament of your pet. So we'll start with an image, and this image is in full color, and I am working right now in Photoshop. So this is something you can do at home using GIMP or Photoshop if you have it. So the first thing you need to do is change your image mode to grayscale. And it's going to ask you if you want to discard the information. I just say discard it. So now my image is in black and white. So now that it's in black and white, I can actually work with bitmaps now. So I have to go back to image mode and go to bitmap. And I have a new pop-up box. And this is going to ask me a few questions. My resolution tells me my input is 72 pixels per inch. So that is what my image is. It has 72 pixels per inch. Now I can output my own number. I can change this to be whatever I want. So I'm going to start with 72 just to show you guys an example. And I'm going to change this. I'm always going to keep this at pixels per inch instead of centimeter. That's just how I work. And then there's different method types. So for bitmaps, you have a few options on how to change bitmap. And we're going to play with these just so you can understand the difference. So there's threshold, pattern dither, diffusion dither, halftone screen, and a custom pattern, which is similar to halftone, but you can kind of use your own shapes. So I'm going to start with 50% threshold and just hit OK. And you can see this instantly changes my image to be that sharp 1 bitmap black and white, but it's so sharp and I can't really see the dog anymore. And there's these lines I don't really like. So I'm just going to undo it. And I'm going to go back to image mode bitmap. And I'm going to show you the next one, pattern dither. This one's a little bit better. You can see that it has that black and white tones. If I zoom in, you can see that we're getting a lot of patterns here. And you can kind of see that the dog is still there, but it might be a little bit fuzzy and there's still some things I don't like about it. So we can keep exploring. So now let's try diffusion dither. So this one's a little bit better. It's very grainy though, so I don't know how well it would look if I put this on wood, but I do think that the picture itself looks a lot better, and you can definitely see that that dog is very strong. And we're gonna do halftone. Now when halftone comes up, there's a few more options you get to do. You can change the frequency, the angle, the shape of the halftone, which has a few different shapes. It's very common to see it in round or lines. And then it's lines per inch or lines per centimeter. Automatically it's set to 500 and an angle at 45 degrees. I'm just gonna keep that. So it's very similar to the diffusion. And if you kind of squint, or depending on how you're looking at this, you can see those like little lines like from far away. Even more so if I zoom out, you can kind of like see a lot of difference. So it's kind of crazy, the details, but remember this is a digital, we're looking at it on the screen, and kind of get an idea of how it would look printed. So I don't love that, but what I want to show you next is what if I changed that output to 150. So I might raise it. So remember we were looking at those dots per inch. This is kind of getting to that area. Let's try threshold again. So the same kind of problem, and still too sharp. And if I do pattern, it's a little bit better. I like the way this looks a little bit more, but I think it could definitely be sharper. But let's see what diffusion dither looks like. So the diffusion is really nice because the graininess kind of blends in well, and it makes it kind of almost look like old-timey. For now, I'm going to keep it at pattern dither. Let's try 300. So you can see how much like it washes out. So whatever bitmap for images you're trying to use, it really depends on what is happening as in your subject. Now you can see there's a lot of blurriness here. This is a dog, so there's like a lot of detail in the fur, where depending on what image you're using, like maybe you're using something a lot more sharp and crisp. So it's important to play around to get it exactly how you want. So I'm gonna keep it like this because we're gonna play with it a little bit more. And it's not perfect, but I'm gonna show you another trick. So if this was something that you were ready to go, then you can just export as a PNG, you can save it and send it off to the library to get it made onto your project. We are going to bring this into Illustrator. Let's see. And this image is now in Illustrator, and what I want to do with it is turn it into a vector image. So Illustrator is my vector program. And if you want to do this at home, you can use GIMP and Inkscape for the vector portion. Now, something that is a little another like trial and error, something to play with, is to image trace a design or image trace a photo. Now, it's better to do it when it's already changed to black and white. It's probably changed into a bitmap. If you just do it with color, it's very possible too. But once you have your image placed in Illustrator, I have it on my sidebar here. Where is my, Image trace. It's under object. Okay. Object. This is what happens when you use too many keyboard shortcuts all the time. So if I have this image selected, I actually have a new dialog box on the top of my Illustrator. My Zoom was covering it. So if I see that little caret next to the word image trace, I have a bunch of different options here. There's high fidelity photo, 3 colors, 16 colors, shades of gray. These are all more of like things to experiment of what works for your image and what doesn't. I might try shades of gray just because that's kind of what I see, but I also like to use black and white logo a lot. Yes?
We're still seeing Photoshop.
Oh, you are? Well, that's not good. Thank you. Is that better?
Yes.
Thank you. Okay. All right, here's my dog in Illustrator. So I'm going to click this image trace option here. And these are my options that I was talking about. So my photo, my colors, and these are options that you can pick. So once you click on any one of them, you're going to see your progress bar start to load. And depending on your image, it might take a while. So it's important to just be patient. So you can see this really changes the image. There's a lot of details that have been changed. A lot of dots have turned to lines and it kind of looks crazy. So maybe that wasn't the best option as far as what preset to use, or maybe I need to go into my advanced methods and kind of edit some of my details on how to make it a little bit better. So maybe I'll change my preset from shades of gray to black and white. And it does take a while since this image had a lot of information in it, which is a lot of pixels, a lot of color. So it looks a little bit better. And maybe it would be better if I went back and edited the bitmap more. So the threshold kind of changes some of that color. So it's taking out some black and white. All right, so the dog is not perfect, but we're going to use it for an example anyway. So if I want to put my image, I have some shapes for ornaments here. So if I want to do a circle ornament, ornaments are usually range of size, where this is 3 inches. But my dog image is huge. So I'm just going to scale my image down. And it's still taking a lot of time because it's still technically a raster image, which we'll talk about in a moment. So I just reduced it by 50%. I'm going to put my circle on top of the dog and change my circle to have a thick red outline so you guys can see what I'm doing. And that might be a little, the picture might still be a little bit big. So I'm just going to kind of use the handlebars to shrink it. And it's going to process again. And it's still processing because it's raster. So now if I like this size a little bit better, I want to actually vectorize it. So you'll see on the top, it says expand. Expand is when it's going to convert these little dots and things into actual vector shapes. So if I hit expand, it's going to go through that same processing phase, but now it's actually a vector shape. So if I zoom in, it's full of vector dots. So you can actually use a bitmap or change your bitmap to be a vector image. So that's something that's just good to know depending on the project you're doing. If you wanted to actually put a photo into a shape, you can simply mask it. So I'm going to highlight the two of them. Oh, I have a secret circle. I'm going to highlight the two of them and mask it. But you don't want to lose your circle. That is what you're going to need to cut out. So it's good rule of thumb, copy your circle or shape, mask your image, so does it want to do? There we go. I'm going to paste that circle back in front. And let's say I kind of like how thick this red stroke is. Actually, let's say I want to make it 20. I want to have it like a big frame around the dog. But remember, a stroke has to be like a filled line. So if I outline the stroke, so it's going to become a shape, I need another tiny circle so I have something for it to hang on. I'm going to select everything, center it. And this one, I'm going to do the same thing. And what I would want to do is make sure that this inner circle is either how many inches or how many millimeters, and make sure this hole is big enough for piece of string to go through, piece of ribbon, depending on whatever I want to use. Which it looks okay, just for testing. I'm going to also outline this one. And I don't want these to be two different shapes since this is going to be an ornament and it's just going to be together. So I'm going to grab my Pathfinder and combine the shapes together. And if I show you the outline, this is actually outlining everything. Now, the only thing I don't want though, is maybe I don't want that inner line. Selecting the dog. But in general, there you have it. There's your little ornament of your pet. And you can use different images, and we can put text on here, and you can easily make this as a very quick gift, or do something for yourself for the holidays. And I encourage you guys to do something fun and make a cool design. So if you guys have any questions I can answer, I'd love to help, because the library will make this project for you. So you guys should definitely design something at home and send in something to make for the holidays or the future.
Hi, I have a question.
Yeah.
How do we actually go about like sending our file to the library and coordinating like how to have this made, our project?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and send out instructions to everyone right after the program for how you can send us your files, and then you'll be able to pick them up using our curbside services. And we do have 1/4 inch and 1/8 inch wood available that you can use for free to create your project.
Wow, that's awesome. Thank you.
And also after this, I'll send out a list of all the different materials you can use on our Glowforge. I saw the question about a block of glass. That's not something we'd be able to do on our Glowforge, unfortunately.
Since we have a few minutes, I'm going to go back to my presentation really quick and just look at the Glowforge. Even though you guys aren't using it yourselves, the Glowforge has different options on how to import your artwork. So what is really interesting is when you import your artwork, you're using an app for the Glowforge. So it's web-based. And once you import, you're first going to pick your material. Your material will auto-populate like different settings for whatever project you're using, which is very convenient and makes it very easy to not have to guess what like settings to do. But if you needed to, something you can do is each one, like engrave, cut, score, ignore. These are all specific for the Glowforge. And each one you can set manually what type of material to do. So if you guys were ever able to do this on your own, I'd recommend like doing a test sheet on whatever material you wanted, so you can make sure that your project is going to turn out the way you want. But it's also just good for yourself to know, like, do a test piece. Like I do my own test piece, and sometimes when I don't, I messed up. So it's fun to use.
Any other questions?
I'm just curious, what versions of Illustrator and Photoshop were you using?
I'm using the most current because I have the Creative Cloud, but you can use an older version. And no matter what you export it at, when you send it out for the Glowforge, like it takes so many different files, like it even takes a JPEG. So you can send it as a PDF, you can send it as an Illustrator file, and it can be, it can still work.
And we do have access to all of that software in Creative Experience at both Central and Barr Library. So when we do reopen to the public, you could always come in and use those there as well.
Okay, thank you.
Great, well, thank you so much, Anna, and I'll send everyone, we don't have a planned reopening at this time. We're kind of monitoring the situation to see how things are going with COVID. So as soon as we do have a planned date to reopen, we'll post that on our website and social media and send out an e-blast to customers.